preface a little bit about evolution because there are a lot of misconceptions about evolution. One is that when people say, I don't believe in evolution, you're going to learn evolution is happening right in front of our eyes with COVID right now, right? All the variants that keep changing. The virus is evolving. There's evolution in action. So there's two parts to evolution. One is there is a hypothesis part of evolution, and this might be where your brain, if you're one of those people who say, I don't believe in evolution, this is probably the part that you have misconceptions about. You may believe that life started from some higher being. Science says, cool, have that belief. There are hypothetical, meaning that there are scientists who have shown how life may have started. It's a hypothesis. It's not concrete. Nobody has evidence to show, boom, this is how life started. So if you believe in a higher being, again, science says, cool, have it, go for it. Eventually, we do know facts, information that supports ideas about evolution. And so, like, for example, we, again, are seeing the evolution of the coronavirus, COVID-19. We are seeing evolution. It is happening. We are seeing changes in that particular strain of virus. Does that have anything to do with how life started? No. Okay, so there's evidence, and we're going to talk about evidence today. And then at the end of the semester, I'm going to give you all these hypotheticals about here's how life may have started. So just to preface that. Because I know a lot of times students will come in and be like, oh, evolution first, I don't believe in it. And then I'm like, okay, why? And then you gotta question why. Question why you have these thoughts and then look into it. All right, so ideas about evolution go back a long time. Some of the first ideas that were written about evolution were with the Greek philosophers. Again, if you don't, so a couple things. I have the PDF of my notebook. It's in Canvas. So if you're somebody who likes to use a tablet with a stylus and take notes into that, you don't need to buy this if you don't want to, as long as you've got it on. So you can go right to Canvas, and the PDF of this is there. If you have a tablet and you want to take notes onto that with your stylus. Just please make sure you're taking notes. If you don't have a tablet and you just have a notebook, a lot of this will kind of be ambiguous, and I'll go quickly through because there's only the blanks that you need to take. So I would say just maybe listen and watch if you don't have a tablet. And then also the PDF, I start probably around page 80 on the PDF because sometimes we do ecology first and sometimes we do evolution first. So it's about page 80 will match up with evolution. Somewhere around there, 84-ish, 86. No, not today, no. I would say just maybe listen, yeah. Yeah, that'd probably be, because the notebook you'll get like bits and pieces and it won't make any sense anyway when you go home today. So it's probably more beneficial to you, unless there's something like you want to draw out or whatever. So just in terms of like data that we have, ideas about evolution, we have from ancient Greece, where philosophers
Slide 71.
Yeah, right there. 71, thank you. 71 in the PDF. Thanks so much. So, one of the first big ideas about evolution was a philosopher named Anaximander, and he had the idea that life started out very simple and that eventually became more complex. That is something that we know stands today. Aristotle, not everybody had great ideas that hold today. Aristotle had this idea of fixed species, and he thought that species were put on the earth as they are and they never changed. Well, that's not true, because we do know that things change, right? We are seeing this, and not that the virus is a living thing, but we are seeing things that interact with living things like a virus changes. And so we know that things change. He also had this idea, and this always cracks me up, of a ladder of perfection. And he felt that the more perfect a species was, the higher they were on this ladder. Look who's at the top. Oh, no, we've only been around the earth, like in our kind of more modern form, maybe like 3 million years. And look what we've done in 3 million years. We have like impacted every species on the earth negatively. No, we're not so great. We are not so great. Perfection even included like inanimate matter, like rocks, for example. Plants, oh sorry.
Species aren't necessarily perfect either. Evolution is not perfection, it's just what works, and what works, and it's not really the organism that's changing by itself, it's the environment that's forcing the organism to change to fit that environment.
Right, to fit the environment, exactly. Great point, yes. Plants. Now this always cracks me up that he put plants so low, but can humans survive without plants? No. We need food from plants, and we need oxygen from plants. So shouldn't they be probably way above us, right?
They've been around longer.
Yeah, they've been around longer, but they are not lower. So this is kind of goofy. Also, there's not bacteria. They didn't even know anything about bacteria or what we call prokaryotic organisms, single-celled organisms that don't have a nucleus, that have been around for billions of years and can survive in many changing environments. So not such a great idea. George S. Buffon in the mid-1700s had some good ideas based on research that he did. He figured out that fossils are remnants of ancient ancestors. So we have pieces of our past that you can look at and see how did things change based on these fossils. He also proposed that the Earth was probably older than 2,000 years. Everybody was like, the Earth is 2,000 years, that's a really long time. And he started looking at fossils, and he was like, I think it's a lot longer. Now, people, when ideas came about, and a lot of people accepted it, which is kind of the way human nature is, that people would be like, you're crazy. And so a lot of these philosophers and scientists who started to have ideas that were more scientific and maybe went against current logic or accepted ideas, people thought they were crazy. So it was like one of those, like, it's like political, right? You have to be careful what you say to whom and get people on your side, show the evidence. He found fossil matter of this. This is called the Galapagos. This is about the size of a car. It looks very similar to the modern day armadillo, which is like this big. So over time, you can see that they have a lot of similar characteristics, but like you said, the environment changed over time. Climate change has always been happening. So when people say, I don't believe in climate change, it's like, well, it's been happening for billions of years. Since the Earth first formed. The climate went from hot to cold, hot to cold, hot to cold. We have evidence of that. So climate change has always been happening. We are accelerating heat in our climate to a point that we have never seen in the history of the Earth. So again, it's like a lot of those things where people just glom onto something, and you always, when you have a misconception, you should start to ask yourself, why do I have this? And a lot of times it's because your parents taught you it, or you were exposed to a certain school, and in school they taught you this. So in your training as a scientist at the college level, and just kind of in general in life, when you have an idea and there's other people who have a different idea, stop and think about, why do I have this idea? And look deeper into what kind of information supports that. And if we all did that at this day and time, because you are bombarded by information, right? It's all over. You're constantly getting told things. My son is always coming to me and saying blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no. And then I get out like my biology textbook on my computer and I'm like, well, right here, let's go over this and these pictures. And he's like, oh my God. But the challenging of why you think something is really important. So evidence for this being the size of a car, eventually over millions of years comes this. The idea here too, it changes something that people thought, that in evolution things started out small and they got big. This is big to small. Let's think about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs and current birds and reptiles. Dinosaurs were big, right? Current birds and reptiles are small. The environment was much different back then. There weren't humans around to mess up the environment. Plants were big. Animals were big. There was not a lot of species on the actual earth, on the dry part of the earth. So being big was favored by the environment at that time. Eventually, what happens is a meteorite hits the earth, causes a huge dust explosion to cover the atmosphere, blocks out a lot of the sunlight. All the big plants can't get enough sunlight to keep themselves going, to keep producing food for the big herbivore dinosaurs. If they start to die off, the herbivore dinosaurs are gone, the big plants are gone, or they're getting little, not as many in quantity. So the carnivore dinosaurs don't have enough to eat. They start to starve, but little small creatures like mammals, who are more of our direct relatives, are hanging out in the trees, hiding from the dinosaurs. They can feed off bits of plant that can grow. And so when the dinosaurs start to die off because of the lack of food in the system, the mammals start to increase in number. The mammals were small. They did get bigger over time. Dinosaurs were big. Any dinosaurs that were smaller as a species survived. So, doesn't always have to be small to big. It can be big to small. And things, because the environment changes over time, right? The climate changes, hot to cold, hot to cold, hot to cold. What can happen is species can be big, small, big, small. It's what is favored to survive in the environment at that time. What form, or what we call an adaptation, is favored based on what the environment has available right now. That's what evolution is about. There's no magic to it, right? If we just suddenly had a flood, could you be like, I'm gonna sprout wings and gills so I can survive better? Can you force yourself to evolve? No, in flood, we're gonna swim a lot, right? If all the buildings got covered and we were forced to swim all the time without stopping, do you think it would be good news for humans and their survival? No, we're not favored in a total water environment. Fish will be good. Whales will be good. Sea creatures will be good. Birds can fly. So, what's favored by the environment is your adaptations, or what traits you have based in your genetics right now. All right, let's go back to ideas about evolution. Lyell, in the 1800s, he also looked at fossils. So Buffon and Lyell were they were digging in the ground and finding evidence of ancient organisms. And now Lyell is like, I think actually the Earth is old too. Yeah, and people are like, no way, it's like 2,000 years old. What if he came up with, I think the Earth is billions of years old? Because that's what we know. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Then they really would have been like, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now we're getting into a little bit later in time. He came up with the idea of adaptation. So everything I was just talking about is the form you have right now will help you or not help you survive in the environment right now. You could be like really great at surviving right now, and something big changes in the environment. A meteorite hits, causes this dust around the earth, a flood, an earthquake. So the environment can change. And when the environment changes, a species is reliant on the diversity of their genetics and their traits to keep them going during that change in the environment. That's what adaptation is about. But, you know, we don't have crazy ideas, right? We're all like, you could be like, I have this great idea, and then you start talking about something else, and maybe your friends or family are like, okay, that one's dumb. Okay, so Lamarck, you know, he was on the right track with that. But then he also was like, I have this idea about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. When we talk about characteristics, the way we look, the way we act, the way we behave, our internal physiology, those are our characteristics. What are characteristics based in? What? Genes, good. So genes, DNA. What his idea was is that, let's say that I have dyed my hair blue and I give birth to a baby. Lamarck was like, your baby will have blue hair too. Could that happen? No, I genetically have this color hair, not blue. So, no. Acquired means that you get it from the environment. So if you're born with crazy teeth like this, and then you get to be a little older and you get braces and you have perfectly straight teeth, might your child be born with crazy teeth? Probably, right? Yeah.
So does he think that the superficial changes get passed on, or does he think that that's...
Yes. He thinks the superficial changes, the things that we can do to ourselves, get passed on, which, no. You know, changes are based in genes, DNA, genetics. So he didn't know about that, but, you know, bad ideas eventually might cause other people or yourself to be like, maybe not, maybe that's kind of dumb, right? You ever have a bad idea and then it leads to a really good idea? Yeah, we've probably all done that, right? So here we can see that these are kind of the main players in evolutionary time. And then the biggest impact on the ideas of evolution were Darwin and Wallace. Now Darwin, he was a little bit older than Wallace. So let's talk about Darwin and then we'll get to Wallace. But these guys had both ideas. They came up on their own. Very similar ideas about evolution and natural selection, but Wallace came later. So let's talk about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, he was born in 1809. He came from a very prestigious family, a rich family, in England, Britain. And his dad was a doctor, and the family was like, you will be a doctor too. And Darwin started to train in medicine, and Darwin would pass out at the sight of blood. And he's like, I can't do this. This is not my thing. I like to study the natural world outside of humans. And so he begged and pleaded with his family to let him go this other track of science. And eventually what happened was he was aboard a big exploratory voyage on the HMS Beagle. Now this is also interesting because here where he was from, that's where many voyages in Europe initiated. And what started with is there's a big classism issue, which still exists today, stupid humans, that the captain was a higher class than the rest of the crew. And so the captain, on these long voyages that might have been like months to years, was like, I cannot socialize with these people. And so a lot of captains went crazy because they had nobody to talk to because they were just stupid, right? That's just being a jerk. So eventually what happened is they started hiring naturalists like Charles Darwin to come, and every time they stopped at a location, the naturalists would get out and would take samples of the plants and dig around for fossils and take drawings of what they saw. and they were a higher class companion for the captain. So that's how Darwin got on these exploratory voyages. And Darwin brought back all kinds of stuff. And when he got back, he was like, I have ideas. Oh, I have ideas. This thing called evolution. And he started talking about it. People were like, he needs to go into an insane asylum. He needs mental health treatment. He's crazy. And Darwin was like, no, but look at all this evidence. And people were like, So Darwin kind of went into his lab for years and wrote a lot of ideas down and produced papers and books and didn't talk about it much because he was really shunned by society. Eventually, Wallace, he starts hearing of other people who had ideas because they were explorers and had ideas similar to what he had, and Wallace presented a paper at a conference, and Darwin was like, that's what I've been saying, but maybe 30 years later it was a little more accepted because more people were talking about it. So Darwin really kind of suffered intellectually for quite a long time. What Darwin found was that when he traveled around, he found that organisms looked different depending on where they lived and the climate they were in, the environment they were in. So for example, they had these what they would call hares, bigger rabbits. Back in England, where it was a little bit colder than South America, wet and cold makes you colder, right? And so the hares, which were bigger in size and had more fat on them, they had all these characteristics that allowed them to survive in cold weather. Fat, thick fur. They didn't have very big ears. One of the things about ears is that when ears are really long, what the ears do is they radiate heat off the body. So they wanted to keep, what was favored were small ears that kept heat closer to the body. But when he went to South America, he saw things, smaller ones, that looked really similar to the hares back home, except for they had really thin fur, they had really long ears, and they were real skinny. They didn't have a ton of fat on them because they needed to be cool. So he was like, everywhere he went, things that he saw at home, he saw similarities, and every similarity wherever he went, there was a different version of that original thing at home based on what the environment was like where he went. That's called adaptation. He also was like, yeah, the earth has got to be really old because you can't just sprout wings, right? I can't just be like, I sprout wings. I can't will myself to change my genetics. Species cannot will themselves to evolve. You have what you have in your genetics. It is either favored, your genetics are favored in the environment, and you survive easier, or your genetics are not favored, you struggle to survive. If you struggle to survive, you're probably not having a ton of babies because then you're going to struggle yourself and struggle to keep your babies going, so you're probably not going to reproduce. So the changes, the adaptations over time, the characteristics that are favored in the environment will produce most often more offspring and produce in larger quantities the genetics that are favored in the environment. That's evolution. Can that happen quickly? We have generation time, right, of offspring. So because we have to go from here's what's favored, reproduce, give those favored traits to your offspring, the offspring have offspring, that takes a long time to happen. So evolution is not a quick thing. It takes a really long time. And so based on the fossils and the adaptations of different species, Darwin started to go, I think this is going to take a while, which means that if this all takes a while for these changes, then the Earth's really old. He also was like, how did that rabbit there and this rabbit, the hare, and the rabbit, how did they get so far apart from each other, yet they're so similar? It would take a long time, right? They didn't have a plane or a train or a boat. So it's going to take a while for something that originates here or here to get to other places on the earth. So he was like, a lot of these ideas, he was like, I think the earth's old. I think the earth is old. So fossils are a great piece of evidence. He found fossils like the glyptodont and the armadillo. He found fossils that showed similarities, but based on the other things that he found, like he might have found some like plant impressions and fossils of different species, and he was like, all of this kind of goes together. So he kind of conjured, based on digging in a certain layer, what environment at that layer, time, what it was like. And he started to put pieces of a bigger puzzle together. One of the most famous places that he wrote about was the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are at the equator off the coast of South America. It is very hot there. There's a ton of sunlight there. It is very humid, so there's a lot of water availability, which makes for a great environment for our primary producers, the plants, who everything else relies on. They can grow really well. They're favored there. So because our primary producers are abundant, that means that community could support a lot of other communities. And so you have a great diversity of species the closer to the equator. Further you get from the equator, you have changes in the temperature, changes in the amount of water available, changes in the amount of sunlight. That's why if you look at the Antarctic, which has 173 days of complete darkness a year, doesn't have a lot of living things there. Water's locked up in ice. Plants don't grow well in general in really cold temperatures, and plants need sunlight. So, Galapagos Islands, there's a lot of good ideas here. For example, he looked at, so you might be thinking like the finches, I heard about the finches, the birds. But let's talk about something else that he found. So there's different species of iguanas. So I'm going to compare two of them that Darwin saw. When he was on land, when he was like more inland where there's like forests, he saw a lot of these, the green iguanas. Real slim, long pointy face, somewhat smooth of a head in comparison to the marine iguana, who's got a giant head, huge stout head. Bumps, very big triangles, pyramids all over the head. I want to show you behavior of this, which I'm going to get you thinking about. All right, so a little bit about the green iguana just to see what it looks like.
Dinosaurs have been extinct for 65 million years. Now believe that the social lives of the modern iguanas may show us how the dinosaurs behaved.
So that modeled iguana, look at the coloration. The green, so this is another species. The green iguana is all green. So likely the green iguana lives where there's just green plants and it can blend in and hide amongst the plants. This one probably lives amongst some kind of flowers, or maybe where there's like trees and fungus, because you see browns and greens and oranges. So where it is favored is amongst an environment that are these colors so that it can blend in.
After 3 months buried in their eggs, baby green iguanas burst out ready to go.
So you can see they're very green, right? Very different in coloration. So just to give you an idea of some of the coloring differences that might be favored. And then here's a behavioral adaptation that will be favored. what is it doing?
Sneezing salt.
It's spewing salt by mucus. So it is purposefully sneezing into its environment because marine iguanas, their main food, the producer in their environment is not a plant, it's algae. So the main three producer groups on our planet are plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. And so these three, like we think about like plants, that we mainly rely on plants, but I bet a lot of you eat those seaweed snacks, right? The little sheets of seaweed that are like flavored with salt or teriyaki or something. So there's a lot of environments where seaweed, and most organisms on the earth actually rely on seaweed or algae more than plants themselves. So these guys eat seaweed that grows on rocks near the shore. In the ocean shore, it is crashing against these rocks. So it is a very tumultuous, active environment. It's rough. So they've got to be really, really buff. They got to be thick. They got to have thick skin. Their skin's a lot thicker because they might go against rocks that will be rough. So skin of them is much thicker. Because what they're eating is algae on rocks, they dive down and they use those spikes on their head to scrape the rocks of the algae and release the algae free in the water. So they're doing a lot of this. So they're scraping, they're using those points on their head to scrape. Because when they're in the water, they're grabbing at the algae, but they're also getting mouthfuls of seawater too. And so they get kind of like, you know, like if you have something that maybe you're like trying to get one thing that you're eating and you might spit the rest of it out. That's what they're doing, is they're like, but they're still getting a lot of salt content from the algae. How many of you regularly, as part of your diet, drink salt water? Anybody? No, because it's very dehydrating. And so salt, for any living thing, high salt content is not good for us. Is we want to get that salt out of our body for the most part. Salt is an important component of our health, but too much salt can cause things like hypertension. So we want to have this balance of a little bit. And so they're getting a ton of salt, which too much salt is very bad for you. So they spit some of it out, but some of it they're still getting with the algae that they're eating. And so inside of their head and around their mouth is they have tons of mucus glands. And what the mucus does is it traps the salt before it goes into the digestive system. But now this mucus that's filled with salt, they've got to get rid of it. So they're constantly like, are like sneezing that out. So imagine that you're a female and you're looking at a male. There's two main things that you're probably looking for as attractive. One is that they've got a really big head with big spikes on it. Two is that they can shoot mucus a lot. So that's sexy. So humans, we've got like a real messed up version of what's attractive, right? So attractive might be somebody that works out and they've got this very muscular body, so they work out a lot, and they're very particular about what they eat. Now, dating someone like that might be really hard. If you're not somebody who's into working out, and you're just pretty easygoing about it, you can go to any restaurant and just like find something easy to eat. You start dating this person, and they're like, well, I can't meet you till 8 o'clock because I've got to get my workouts in. And you're like, well, I like to eat dinner at like 7 at the latest, right? So that's a pain. And then also you go to a restaurant and they're like, I need this, and you know, I want this, but I don't want this, and this. And then it comes, and if there's one thing wrong, they're like, oh, that's not what I ordered, they got it wrong. That's annoying. But that's attractive, right? So humans, we've got like this real kind of messed up idea of attractiveness, because that you don't want to put up with that, right? Whereas people who might have, you know, like a little more insulation on them, if humans were like really looking at adaptation, is that you might be like, well, that person, if there was a famine or food ran really low because we have a pandemic, that person could survive for quite a long time without food. That's hot, right? So we don't equate attractiveness with adaptation very well as humans. Whereas that's hot. So what Darwin looked at when he was looking at all of the different islands of the Galapagos, there's hundreds of islands there. And every island he went to, he saw similar species, but depending on what food was available on a particular island, kind of gave way to what was favored, what adaptations were favored in different species that lived there. And so every time he went to a different island, he was like, well, that's a little bit different. Oh, that makes sense because like birds' beaks, like these finches, what he looked at was the size, the shape, any features on the beak that would relate to the food that was available. So for example, if there were trees that had a lot of nuts that were really big, and that was like the main protein source for the birds, he saw that the finches had very large beaks with very sharp serrations on the edges of the beak so that they could crush and open up those seeds. He went to another island where there were really tiny little seeds. And so the beak size was very small with serrations to cut open those seeds. Or if he went to an island and the plants had very thick leaves, he saw that the beak was very well adapted to eating very thick plants. So everywhere he went, he saw a correlation between adaptations of different species and the food that was available. And so that's kind of his famous idea about these finches. So here again, you can see that you have a bird with a beak that would be good for crushing seeds open, or a bird with a really pointy beak that could grab insects from small hiding places. And a beak for a vegetarian bird has a lot of serrations and has like a funny curve that the bigger part, the top part is much bigger than the bottom part, so bigger and smaller. And then a pointy beak to eat around cactus spines. So all of them were very well suited to their environment. Oh, the other thing he found was that the mainland of South America had birds that looked real similar to all those birds that he saw on the islands. That they had like a base similarity, but again, different characteristics depending on what kind of food was available. All right, so here comes Wallace, a little bit later than Darwin. And Darwin's been working away in his lab and writing books and taking notes and sorting all of his fossils and his data. 16 years later, Wallace presented all of these ideas that Darwin had about adaptation and evolution and the age of the earth, natural selection. Nature selects for the organisms that have the best traits in the current environment. Natural selection, nature selects for the traits. Wallace was saying all the same things. So Darwin and Wallace came up with these ideas independently. Do you ever have like an idea about something and you're like, nobody around you has that idea, or they're like, nah, I don't believe in that, or I don't agree with you. And then you meet someone somewhere in the world and they say the same thing you did, and you're like, yes! Yes, you see what I see in the world. Yes, it's so exciting, right? So Darwin was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. But they came up with the ideas independently by themselves. And that kind of feels good, right? When somebody validates you, because they have figured out something that you have figured out, and now you've got that validation, and together you're like, yes, this is awesome. So they both figured out ideas about nature selects for the best adaptations. They traveled extensively. They had lots of drawings and notes and books and papers that they wrote about. So they both together, a little bit later, presented papers together. And then people started to be like, oh, Darwin, you're so smart now. And he's like, come on, you same people were saying I was nuts just like 15 years ago. but feels good, right, to finally be validated in something. And so the biggest thing is that species do change over time, but when we're talking about time and changes, because of generation time of species, they are not immediately taking place. They're taking time. So evolution for most species, because of generation time, is long. Now, if we're talking about bacteria, generation time is like 20 minutes. So their evolution can be a lot quicker. Or a virus particle that is not a living thing like we're seeing right now, it's just a particle, has a quick generation time, or quick evolution. So generation time really depends on how quick something can evolve. But in general, evolution takes a really long time. All right, so natural selection. Nature selects for those that have the most advantageous traits, meaning that, so let's just think about this. So you have a day. You wake up and you're like, I'm late for class! And you run out the door and you just like grab your books and you leave and you're like, shoot, you get here and you're like, I did not bring my wallet. I did not bring a snack that I usually bring. And then you go the whole day of classes and you don't have anything to eat. And you have to go right to work, and you go right to work and you're immediately working. And then you have your work break and you're like, I don't have any money, I still can't eat. You get home at 11 o'clock at night, you haven't eaten all day. What's the first thing on your mind? Food. Any of you think sex? After I'm starving all day, I get home and I'm like, I want to have sex. No, you're not thinking that. You are not thinking about reproduction. You are thinking about what you need to survive right now. So when species are not well fed, or for whatever reason that they may not be surviving very well, their focus is on how am I going to survive? Their focus isn't like, I'm going to have sex, I'm going to have offspring so I can take care of them poorly. No, right? We're not, as species in general, survival is number one. Sex and reproduction come later. If you survive well, if you're comfortable, you're well fed, you don't have predators coming after you, there's not a lot of diseases, you are comfortable, you're surviving easily, you have time for sex, you have time to take care of offspring, you can also help your offspring survive well. So those with the most advantageous traits in nature, natural selection, nature selects for those species that have the best advantageous traits right now. What if the environment changes? Well, who's favored, what traits are favored can change. So we might see a shift in the percentage of a trait over time changing based on, is it good in the environment right now? Is it not good in the environment right now? Because the environment changes. We know it can change pretty quickly. Okay, so I have some questions. I'll have you read this over. I put them in lecture to kind of like check in on your learning. So let's read this over. The existence of species of flightless birds with wings suggests what? So here's birds, right? Like there's a species of ostrich that is really big. It has wings, but it can't fly because it's too heavy. What's up with the wings, right? So A, they are not related to flying birds. B, they are descended from flying birds but have adapted to their particular environment. That sounds pretty good. Let's read on though. C, they are more related to bats than to flying birds. I mean, maybe, but if it's a bird, right? It's not a bat, it's a bird. So that started to sound good, but then, oh no, it's probably more related to birds because it's a bird. They are closely related to fish. What? No, that's stupid. Okay, and they were created in a lab. I mean, maybe, but probably not. Out of these, the best answer is B, right? So that's the way you should approach taking tests. Is even though right away I was like, that one, A, B sounded really good. Read on, just in case there's something better. When you're taking tests, you can write on the exams. So one thing that is very beneficial is that you could cross A off. You could circle B, star it. C, you could be like bats, but pertinent, and then cross that off. Closely related, no, and no. So write on your exams. When you take boards, you probably take them on computers now. So on the computer, you can kind of mentally do that, right? But make sure you read everything. Okay, so Darwin and Wallace had 3 principles of nature that both of them led to the idea of natural selection and evolution. So one is traits are passed on from parents to offspring. Yeah, right? Genetics. We know that the way you look, your internal physiology, the way you behave, your behaviors are based in what your biological mother and father have to some extent, right? Some of those things combine, and then they make you. So we see some of those traits passed on. Inheritance wasn't really well known, right? Mendel didn't come around until the later 1900s, or the early 1900s, I should say. So they had ideas about it, but they didn't know, like Darwin and Wallace were both like, we know that like offspring look like their parents, but they didn't know why or how. So they started kind of having those ideas, but it was like these basic principles that Mendel would maybe read and go, there's something there. There's something there that controls all of this. And so these good ideas inspire future ideas. All right, principle 2, more offspring are produced than are able to survive, so resources for survival and reproduction are limited. So you might, again, have like traits that are really good, and right now you have a bunch of offspring who have your similar traits. Environment changes, and some of those offspring die. Not all offspring survive, because traits are not favored. And that's true for every species on the planet. Not every species reproduces either. So survival and reproduction are not determined by chance. I mean, a little bit, but environment usually it like changes, and then you see slow changes over time of who's favored. So your traits are favored in the environment or they're not. It's not just like eating, meeny, miny, mo. This one survives. That's not the way it works. Principle 3, offspring vary among each other regarding their characteristics, and those variations are inherited. So again, we know that traits are inherited. Here's the other thing. This word variations come up now. Variation is very important to species. The more variation in a species, the better that population or that group is. Because if you have a diversity of species, if the environment changes, you have a lot more chances of somebody in your species surviving and keeping your species going. If everybody's pretty much the same, and you're surviving fine, everybody's doing well, and the environment changes, and that change doesn't favor everybody right now, they're dead, they're extinct. So that's another thing in humans that's really messed up, right? We look at certain ideas of what's hot, and it's kind of the same. I'm hoping that biologically we're starting, well, it's more socially, which is so stupid, right? Again, that I'm hoping that we're seeing beauty, what's hot, in more biological ways as human, rather than more of this weird small group influence the idea of beauty. Humans do a lot of things that don't go along necessarily with this. Now, again, remember, be like, well, humans, there's tons of us now, we're doing well. Yeah, but environment's changing. Right? There's a pandemic happening. 543 people on average per day in the United States are dying still. Floods in California happening. People are dying. Tornadoes in Alabama. We're seeing earthquakes. We're seeing, right? People are dying because the environment is changing. So, we've only been around again in our form a few million years in this modern form. So what's going to happen? Variation. Here's a population of the same species of snails. So just like us in this room, we're all the same species, right? Do any of you look exactly the same? No, right? We all look different. We can, by maybe week 2, I will know your names because I know what you look like and I will associate a name with what you look like. Just like here's a species of snail. A lot of variation in color, in pattern. Look at this. Look at the difference between the pattern of this one and this one. This one only has a few swirls. This one has tons of swirls. What's that about? Something in the environment might change and the swirly one gets more favored than the non-swirly one. Or the orange one gets favored over the yellow and brown one. You never know. All right, so we're gonna stop there with lecture today. So before you pack up and leave, hold on please.